Hello, fellow humans. In part 3 of our series Undoing Capitalism, I will talk about the doctrine of hierarchies, which is another fundamental force that drives the behavior of economic agents in a capitalist economic system. What is usually understood by capitalism is that it is an economic system that has three features. The bulk of the means of production are privately owned, either directly or by corporations that are themselves owned by private individuals. Most products are exchanged in a market. That is to say, goods and services are bought and sold at prices determined by competition and not by some governmental pricing authority. Individual enterprises compete with one another in providing goods and services to consumers, each enterprise trying to make a profit, and most of the people who work for pay in this society work for other people who own the means of production. Most working people are wage laborers. Many authors, such as David Schweikart, claim that for an economy to be considered capitalism, it requires all three features. For example, China is not capitalist because the private ownership of the means of production is not dominant. My position, which I call the threefold model of capitalism, is that these features do not describe the fundamental principles of what is going on in capitalism. They are rather symptoms of an underlying arrangement of causal forces, which are proportionality, dispossession, and hierarchies. These three forces create the private ownership of the means of production, the market, and the class of workers who work for the owners of capital. We covered the last two doctrines in the last two videos. Today we are discussing the doctrine of hierarchies, and I will focus on imagining what it would mean to undo this doctrine, which will eventually weaken capitalism itself. The doctrine of hierarchies basically says that those who have power have the sole ability to control what happens to the capital through a mechanism that requires the establishment of hierarchies of power between people. It is also worth saying that in an economic context, power is the ability to do something, the ability to get someone else to do something, and the ability to prevent someone else from doing something. For the sake of the story, we can also think of capital as embodied labor, or in other words, the material results of past labor, which is the definition given by Karl Marx. Okay, so we have these hierarchies in place. They are unelected managers, director, executives, boards of directors, and undemocratic allocation of capital in a top-down fashion through the chain of command, with no input from the lower levels of employees. And listen to this, an entire industry of asset management companies that manage capital without input from the actual owners of that capital. This is a fascinating paradox that has emerged in capitalism. It feels like the realms of power, property, and capital are cannibalizing each other. We are not going to go over how this arrangement came to be, because that is the subject of my future research. So, what would it look like to undo the force of hierarchies? First, economic power should be distributed democratically. What is economic power? It is the ability to command and control economic resources or capital. In practical terms, this means workers should have the power to decide what to produce, how much to produce, and how rewards should be redistributed. This is covered by the idea of economic democracy as described by David Schweikart, which of course can be improved upon. Economic democracy has many advantages over capitalism. Replacing unelected hierarchies with managers selected democratically by workers has the immediate effect of reducing wealth and income inequalities. Workers will have the ability to decide the wages of all managers democratically. They can put a maximum ratio between the lowest and the highest wage. The system can even be designed to replace wages with profit sharing once companies are owned by their workers or by public trusts, as we have seen in Part 1. Second, the allocation of capital should follow egalitarian and ecological principles. We can still use the word capital to describe products and services that have embodied labor in them and which then are sold on the market. But this allocation of capital should recognize that all humans on Earth deserve an equal chance to find their potential in life based on their natural abilities. The allocation of capital by democratic means should moderate the lifestyle of developed countries, similar to what is described by the 2000 Watt Society. At the same time, the poor and developing countries, also known as the periphery countries or the global south, would require help to develop their potential to the same standard, also described by the 2000 Watt Society. Third, the relation between power and capital should respect the biocapacity of Earth. Capitalism has pushed rich countries over the limits of what the planet can sustain, and has done it by using undemocratic and oppressive hierarchies. If we already know that Earth can sustain only so much production and only so much consumption, which is roughly the Western lifestyle from the 1950s in terms of consumption of materials and energy, then we have no choice but to follow what nature tells us in all our economic decisions. In more practical terms, the necessity of rationing our capital becomes inevitable. If we want to survive this century as a civilization, we should start talking about rationing from raw materials to energy production and consumption in such a way that all nations will operate below the limits of Earth. Fourth, the purpose of an organization should be determined by all members of that organization, with input from society. If the business model of a company does not align with planetary boundaries, then the business license of that company should be rejected by a public forum. We cannot afford to create businesses based on the whims of some tech bros, angel investors, or venture capitalists that only care about increasing their wealth. Communities will get together and decide what kind of businesses are needed in that area and give businesses licenses based on the needs of those communities. If some economies of scale are needed, let's say for the production of rail tracks, then nationwide democratic organization would decide that allocation. Simply because we cannot afford to multiply present-day Western lifestyle all over the world from an ecological perspective. Let's see now some examples of capitalism being undone by phasing out hierarchies. As described by the International Cooperative Alliance, 10% of the world's employed population work for a cooperative, which is an autonomous association of persons united voluntarily to meet their common economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations through a jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise. Top 300 cooperatives in the world have a total turnover of $2.4 trillion. What better example we need to show that there is an alternative to capitalist corporations? Of course, in order for capitalism to be completely undone and phased out, all corporations would need to convert to a cooperative model. But that is not enough. The doctrines of proportionality and dispossession will also need to be phased out, and the pursuit of endless growth cannot remain the core incentive. Even cooperatives need to operate within the limits of Earth. A theoretical model proposed by economist Thomas Piketty, which he calls participatory socialism, makes a small compromise with capitalism and resembles economic democracy proposed by David Schweikart. In the system of participatory socialism, a single stockholder owning 100% of the company's stock has 73% of voting rights if the company has 2 salaried employees, including himself. Then 51% if he has 10 salaried employees, including himself, and he loses the majority beyond 10 salaried employees. A single unsalaried stockholder has 45% of the voting rights if the company has fewer than 10 salaried employees, and then this share declines regularly and reaches 5% at 100 salaried employees. We can make any number of variations of how votes are distributed. The bottom line here is that we still have a group of workers separated from those who own capital. That's the compromise. Another theoretical model is proposed by political scientist Isabel Ferreras, which she calls the bicameral firm. Her model combines the one share, one vote principle with the one person, one vote principle. The owners of capital will maintain proportional power in relation to their property, here represented by the number of shares. Workers who are considered investors in labor will get one vote per person. These two groups of people each elect representatives to serve in a two-chamber mini-parliament in the company that is supposed to share the power. This is another way in which a compromise with capitalism is made by maintaining all three causal forces in place. Can capitalism be undone by using compromised models like these? It is hard to say, but I lean towards saying no, because maintaining the doctrine of hierarchies will always lead to concentration of power and wealth inequality. If we added some conditions to the compromise, which will put a maximum limit on wealth, for example, $5 million, and a maximum limit on the power of an individual, then maybe we can strike a deal with capitalism. But the problem is, we also require degrowth. The overall size of the economy needs to shrink until we are back within the limits of Earth, regardless of the compromise we make. And unfortunately, capitalism knows only expansion. It is incapable by design to shrink and keep stable standard of living for workers. You may wonder, is undoing capitalism a socialist agenda? It can be, but it is not a requirement. I understand socialism and my preferred version of it, which is eco-socialism, as a political ideology that has a theory about how governments and nations should be organized. So when we talk about reforming government and the state, undoing capitalism can mean we are deploying an eco-socialist agenda. But we can also talk about economic democracy or the economy for life as political concepts that would replace capitalism. The core of the matter are the fundamental forces that cause the economy to move. The words we use to describe the system matter a little less, I think, since ideological terms such as socialism carry a negative historical baggage. I often refer to the idea of economy for life as an alternative to capitalism. But in essence, I am talking about the same things as socialists or even communists talk about. To recap, the three forces that are the fundamental causes that move capitalism are the doctrine of proportionality, the doctrine of dispossession, and the doctrine of hierarchies. I use the word doctrine because it describes a set of beliefs that must be accepted on faith, as opposed to something objective or determined through the scientific method. This is how capitalism, in reality, functions as a religion. In the next video, we will look at the growth incentive, which is the engine of the system where these forces operate. If we think that the causal forces are the nurture of capitalism, growth is the nature of capitalism. Thank you for watching. Your support on Patreon makes this research possible. I cannot do it without it because I am not rich and I do not want to be rich. Subscribe to the channel to help with the algorithm and remain hopeful that we can replace capitalism with an economy for life. Increase the peace.